host of the king of Syria was a great man with his master, and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captives out of the land of Israel, a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, Would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. And one went out and told his Lord, saying, Thus and thus said the maid that is in the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, Go to, and I will send a letter unto the king of Israel. And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of raiments. And now it skips from verse number 5 to verse number 9, again reading in 2 Kings, the 5th chapter, verse number 9. It says, So Naaman came with his horses and with his chariots, and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. But Naaman was wroth, and went away and said, Behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and strike his hand over the place and recover the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? May I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. And his servant came near and spoke unto him and said, My father, if the prophet had bid thee to do some great thing, wouldst thou not have done it? How much rather then, when he said to thee, Wash and be clean? Then he went down and dipped himself 7 times in Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And he returned to the man of God, and he and all his company, and came and stood before him. And he said, Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Let me give some preference to this morning's lesson, which is titled, A Servant Girl Points Naaman to God. Israel and Syria were 2 nations that had a peace treaty with each other. And Syria, its border was northeast of Israel, which is the northern kingdom. Even though they had a peace treaty, along that border between the 2 countries, there were skirmishes and conflicts from time to time. And this morning's lesson, when one of those skirmishes or conflicts occurred between Israel and Syria, Syria ended up capturing some of the Israelites. In this morning's lesson, it talks about the capture of a servant girl. Now, the kings, as I forestated, had a treaty, the kings of both nations, Ben-Hadad the first and Joram of Israel, who was the king at that time of the northern kingdom. But again, as I forestated, that there were skirmishes on the border and there were conflicts from time to time. But this morning's lesson is neither about either of those kings, but this morning's lesson is about one of the subjects of the king, named Naaman, the king of Syria, and a Jewish girl. Now, the Bible doesn't give us the name of this Jewish girl. All it tells us that she was a maiden, a young lady, a young Jewish girl who was taken captive by the Syrian nation, and she was given to Naaman as a servant, and in turn became the servant or the mistress of Naaman's wife. So as we read in 2 Kings chapter 5, verses number 1, it says, "Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master, and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but he had a skin disease called leprosy." Naaman was held in high esteem by the king he served in Syria, Ben-Hadad the first. Not only was he held in high esteem, he was well valued because he was the king's military commander and the king's military strategist. And as a result of being so, the king knew that in terms of Naaman going to war, his strategies worked well. But it also said in this verse that because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. They didn't give God the credit for blessing Syria when she went into war against the Assyrians. But as a result of going to war against the Assyrians, God blessed Syria, and he blessed Naaman with knowledge and with victory in that war. So again, reading verse number 1 in chapter 5 of 2 Kings, it says, "Now Naaman, captain of the hosts of the king of Syria, was a great man in the sight of the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad I, as well as the people of Syria. He was a great man, and he was also a great man with the king and his master. He was deemed honorable by his master because the Lord had given him victory over the nation of Assyria. But there was one thing or problem that Naaman had, is that he had the skin disease of leprosy." So as I read, it says, "Naaman was a great man. He was esteemed as a prominent person in the nation, enjoyed a high social standing, not only among the king, but also among the people of Syria. Third, he was highly regarded by his master, the king. The word honorable means he was lifted high in the eyes of the king. He was such a capable military leader that the king regarded him as one of the most valuable members of his administration. Scripture clarifies that it was the Lord who gave victory to Iran. Syria is also known by the name of Iran. Through Naaman, so that Naaman's great standing was through God alone. However, King Ben-Hadad the first and the people did not recognize God as being the one who made things possible in terms of Naaman's victory and the Syrians' victory over the nation of Assyria at that time. The Lord has control over all nations. We should remember that whenever a leader or a king is blessed, it is because of God's hands and favor of blessing is upon him. Many times, the person that is blessed, as well as the people of that nation, don't recognize God as the one of being in control and the one that allows greatness for a nation or an individual to happen. But we as believers in God Almighty, we know who the source is, and we know what results as a result of the power and the control of God over all the nations. All nations before him are as nothing, and they are counted to him less than nothing in vanity. Finally, Naaman was a mighty man of valor. He was a fighter. He was a man of war. He was successful. But remember who gave him that success. This refers to his courage and the forceful strength with which he handled himself. There was a lot of good and prominent things about Naaman. All these magnificent truths were tempered by the fact that Naaman had a skin disease, a sort of leprosy, but perhaps not Hansen's disease, with this extremely debilitating effect. There are different kinds of leprosy. There are some in which the skin is affected and white spots and damage to the skin itself occurs. But there are other types of leprosy that debilitate the skin in the body, and the body has sores, and those sores leak and seep, and parts of the body eventually rot away. It is indicating in our lesson that the leprosy that Naaman had was not of that type, at least as yet. But no matter what type of leprosy you have, eventually it gets worse and it gets worse. It was a military raid into Israel that a young girl was captured and given to Naaman's wife as a servant. That's reading verse number 2, where it says, "And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captives out of the land of Israel, a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife." As I forestated earlier, that Syria was northeast of the border of Israel, which is the northern kingdom, not the southern kingdom. And there was a treaty between Israel, the northern kingdom, and Syria. However, along their border, even though there was a treaty of peace among them, there was still conflict off and on, and there were still skirmishes. And as a result of this conflict and skirmishes that occurred between Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel on the border, Syria would invade Israel and take some of its citizens captive. In this morning's lesson, there was people taken captive, and among those people taken captive was a young girl who was a maiden. And as a result of her captivity, she was given to Naaman and to Naaman's wife as his attendant. It says in verse number 2 again, and the Syrians had gone out by companies, gone into the northern territory of Israel, and had brought away captives out of the land of Israel. And they brought a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. Verse number 3 said, and she said unto her mistress, would God, my Lord, were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. Now note that this is a young lady or a young maiden that has been taken away from her parents, and she is now a captive and serving the wife of Naaman as an attendant. You would think that her attitude would be of such that she would give no good advice to those that were holding her in captivity. But we should note, or we should surmise, or even take under consideration that this servant girl coming from Israel had apparently been well taught by her parents or whomever raised her up, because she didn't have a vindictive heart regarding her captives. In fact, it says in verse 3, she makes a suggestion to her mistress, which is Naaman's wife, and paraphrasing it, she said that there is a prophet in the northern kingdom of Israel, in its capital called Samaria. And if our Lord, who she's called, referring to as Naaman, would go to him, he would heal him of that leprosy. Naaman and his wife may have been kind to this young girl, for in time of her master's distress, she became concerned for his welfare. How many servants that are in captivity become genuinely concerned for their master's concern? Very few. Perhaps it was one of those momentarily thoughts put into words, or perhaps she had been thinking about it for a while. In any event, one day she said to her mistress, which is Naaman's wife, would God, my Lord, were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. She was referring to Elisha, the well-known prophet of Israel. Israel had two well-named prophets, one by the name of Elijah and one by the name of Elisha. This is about Elisha, who was the attendant of Elijah, who received the double spirit of Elijah when he was taken up into heaven by a whirlwind. Reading on, it says, the maiden's role in the story is striking. She had seen the war crimes perpetrated by the Syrians. And you know war crimes are devastating. There's nothing nice about them. But even seeing the war crimes, it did not make her bitter toward her captives. She was bereft of her parents, which means that she had been deprived of her parents when she was taken into captivity by the Syrians. Whether through military conflict or otherwise, she was bereft of her parents. She was in fact a young girl stolen from her home. Yet this unnamed maiden felt true compassion toward her captor and master. True compassion. That is unusual, particularly for a young child. Discerning God called that she, a daughter of Abraham, should be a blessing to the Gentiles, she dared profess that the prophet in Samaria could heal Naaman. Now, Naaman and the Syrians were Gentiles. And generally, the Bible tells us how the Jews felt about Gentiles. They looked at them as dogs, but not better than dogs. They hated them. They disliked them. They would not go into their houses because they felt that when a Jew went into a Gentile house, it defiled them. It made them unclean. So again, we have a young Jewish girl, and yet she doesn't practice or feel the bitterness that most Jews felt about Gentiles. Naaman reported to the king, and that's verse number 4, and it reads, as she talked to him about being healed by the prophet, the maiden did, Naaman goes in unto the king. In verse number 4, and it says, and one went in, that's Naaman. He went in unto the king and told his Lord, because Naaman was only second in command to the king. So the king was Naaman's Lord. But it says that, and one went in, being Naaman, and he told his Lord, the king, saying, thus and thus said the maid that is of the land of Israel. Naaman went into the king and told him precisely what the young maiden said, that there is a prophet in the land of Israel, in the capital of the northern kingdom of Samaria, who could heal Naaman of his skin disease, of his leprosy. Naaman reported to the king what the young girl had said. The claim may have seemed wholly impossible. Why? Because there was no cure for leprosy during that time, that at least they knew of. But we know that God has power to cure any and all diseases. But these Gentiles and the Jews knew of no cure for leprosy. But the Jews, aside from the Gentiles, knew the power of God to do miraculous things. It was a disease that ranged anywhere from white spots on the skin to running open sores, and in some forms resulted in gradual loss of fingers and toes and other parts of the body. And not only that, some forms of leprosy were contagious and other forms were not contagious. So apparently what Naaman had was not contagious, because if it had been contagious, then his wife would have had leprosy. His servants in his house would have had leprosy, and he would not have been allowed to go before the king, because having a contagious leprosy, it would also give the king leprosy. At its worst, it gradually rotted away the body until the person died. When Naaman's attitude, what was Naaman's attitude, rather, when he reported to the king? Obviously, Naaman had hope. Obviously, he believed in the compassion and the sincerity of the maiden girl who was in his house. Was he hoping to be given permission to travel to Samaria? He must have had a measure of hope in his heart. Obviously he did, because he went before the king and he expressed to the king the possibility of a cure for him and his leprosy. And the person who could do something about it was his master, the king. In other words, the king could grant him permission to go out into the land where this prophet Elisha was. Verse number 5 reads that, and the king of Syria said, Go to Samaria, where this prophet Elisha is. And I will send a letter unto the king of Israel. And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of raiment. Now the king is granting Naaman permission to go to Elisha, the prophet. But the king sends a letter with Naaman, because in that day, if you went into another country and you were a military man, that country considered it that you were coming in aggression, and it was an act of war. So the king sent, King Ben-Hadad I of Syria sent a letter with his servant Naaman to King Jeroboam of Israel, explaining to him that he was sending Naaman to be cured of leprosy. But King Ben-Hadad of Syria sent the letter to the king of Israel, not indicating, or thinking rather, that it was the king of Israel that had the power to cure Naaman. Because in the letter, there is no mention of the prophet Elisha. So it reads again in verse number 5, and the king of Syria said, Go, and I will send a letter unto the king of Israel. And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of raiment. Naaman is taking gifts with him to give to the king of Israel. As we read in our lesson, the king immediately responded to the news positively. His commander, who was Naaman, was a very valuable to him, and unless something could be done to heal him, he would eventually lose him to the increasingly devastating effects of leprosy. The king's attitude was probably similar to that of people today, who are willing to try any treatment for a life-threatening illness in the hope that something might work, no doubt. He made all the necessary preparations for Naaman. He gave him permission to go first of all. He gave him a letter to go into another land to take to a king to indicate that he did not come as an aggressor. And not only that, he made preparations by giving Naaman silver and gold and presents of clothing. He made all the necessary preparations, therefore, to send Naaman to Samaria. We must remember that all this was happening because of something said by a young slave girl who was convinced that Elisha and his supernatural power to heal Naaman. Why did the girl have belief in Elisha as having supernatural power? We read it in our responsive reading in chapter 4. When the lady's son died and she came to Elisha, Elisha went to the son and he laid upon him face to face, mouth to mouth, hand to hand. And he prayed and he laid upon him again. And the child was dead. However, after Elisha prayed, God gave Elisha the power to restore the life of this young boy. And his mother, the widow, was greatly appreciative. Well, obviously, the young girl had heard about the power of Elisha that healed or brought this young man back from death. In addition to that, when a company of prophets got together, and it says again in the 4th chapter that Elijah requested that they be fed stew, and one of the prophets went out and he picked a wild vine and he cut it up and he put it in the stew, not knowing the effects of the wild vine. And as a result, the wild vine caused death. And again, God gave Elisha knowledge to reverse the effects of this stew, and none of the prophets died that ate this stew. So again, this young girl had knowledge of the prophet Elisha having the gift to restore life through the power of God, not through the power of Elisha. So it says that, again, we must remember that all this was happening because of something said by the young slave girl who was convinced that Elisha had a supernatural power to heal Naaman. By this time in his ministry, Elisha had performed a number of miracles. So having performed a number of miracles, his reputation had preceded him, and he was well known to be a man of God and a man that was given power by God to do miraculous things. So in verse number 5, Elisha leaves the king in Syria and he goes to Samaria to see the prophet Elisha. And Naaman takes with him silver and gold and raiments. Now, the lesson skips from verse number 5 to verse number 9, but I'm going to read from the New International Version, verse number 6, 7, and 8 of chapter 5 of 2 Kings, because it's relevant to give us understanding leading into verse number 9. So, in 2 Kings, the 5th chapter, verse number 6, it reads as follows. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." I indicated earlier that the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad I, sent the letter thinking that the king of Israel had the power to heal Naaman. He had no idea about the prophet Elisha, but the maiden girl did. Verse number 7 reads, and I'm reading from the New International Version. As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robe and said, "Am I God?" All right, the king of Israel says, am I the healer? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me? He's trying to start a war with me. This is the thought of the king of Israel, because he has no healing power. But remember, the Israelites knew the God that had all power. In verse number 8 it says, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message. Now this is the prophet Elisha. Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Elisha, the prophet, requests that the king of Israel send Naaman to him so that he would know that there is a prophet of the true and the living God in Israel. Now we move to verse number 9. And it says that, so Naaman came with his horses and with his chariots, and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. Naaman is now in Syria, and with all the gifts and with all the money, he is at the door of Elisha. Naaman had traveled in a chariot pulled by horses, probably an impressive vehicle worthy of his position and stature. There were only certain of the hierarchy that rode in chariots. Infantrymen, for the most part, did not ride in chariots. It was the military commanders and the kings that rode in chariots. Soon he arrived at Elisha's front door, and surely Naaman's heart was filled with anticipation and excitement, believing what the maiden girl had said, that Elisha could heal him of his leprosy. You too would be excited about being healed. The instructions were simple and were accompanied by a specific promise. And this is what Elisha did when Naaman came to his door. And Elisha sent a messenger unto Naaman. Elijah didn't come out himself, but he sent a messenger to Naaman, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean." When Naaman came to Samaria and came to the door of Elisha, he expected to see Elisha. Remember, he was a prominent man. He was a proud man. He was a man that was in second command only to the king of Syria. He was a man that had servants and messengers. And he was valued by the people of Syria. So why would Elisha send an unimportant messenger to him, instructing him what he should do in terms of receiving cure for his leprosy? Well, our lesson tells us the fact that Elijah simply sent a messenger out to Naaman reveals that he was not overly awed by the presence of Naaman. Naaman was held in high esteem. He was prominent. He was wealthy. He was powerful. However, Naaman did not hold that kind of esteem with the prophet Elisha. Here was the second most powerful man of Syria at his door, but he did not even bother to go out personally and greet him. Just a moment, Danny. The man wanted to be healed, and Elisha had a simple means by which that could be accomplished. The important thing was to get the word to him so that he could follow through and be healed. However, that was not Naaman's perspective. Go ahead, Danny, what is your... No, he is not. He is not. And we, as people, we generally put too much value and too much prominence on other people that God have blessed and that he has given them fame. And as a result, we tend to favor them. Even if they come into the church, we tend to give them the best seats. We tend to be more attentive to them. But they are just people. You know, having played football in college, when we played opposing teams, the other teams had stars as well. And their stardom and their athletic prowess would be broadcast or be presented. But my attitude was he was just another person. He was just another athlete. He put on his jockstrap the same way I did. So why should I be afraid of him? Why should I give him more credit than I give myself? Why should I think his ability was so far more greater than mine that I should take second to him? Well, this is what Elisha the prophet is saying. It's possible, because we do it all the time in church. When a public figure that's prominent and well thought of and well known, we tend to give them favor. We tend to bow to them. Well, there's a difference between bowing and being respectful. Nobody is better than anybody else. That's why the Bible teaches us that God is no respecter of person. God don't care about your title. He don't care about how much money you got. He don't care about the authority you got, or how many men or women or people you got under your power. Because he owns everything anyway. And the only reason that you have those things is because he is allowing you or I to have those things. But there are people that have fame. There are people that have prominence. There are people that are well known, that put themselves above others. And that's what we're dealing with in this lesson. It's called pride. I don't know about you, but I have run into people that had that kind of attitude. Well, I expect to be treated better than this person. Do you know who I am? And they exhibited that kind of aura or that kind of countenance. And that is the kind of pride that Naaman had. So again, as we read in today's lesson, Elijah sends a messenger as Naaman is standing at his front door and tell him to go into the Jordan and to wash, and he will be clean. Naaman accepts that in the wrong way. I'm special. I'm a powerful man. Only the king of my country is more powerful than me. So you got to show me more respect than that. But verse number 11 says, but Naaman was wroth. In other words, Naaman got angry. When you are wroth, you are very angry. And went away and said, behold, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord of his God and strike his hand over the place and recover the leprosy. Naaman is saying that I went to his door. He at least should have come out to me, and he should have went through all of these gestures to heal me. Yet he sends a messenger out to me to tell me what to do. I don't want to hear from a messenger. I want to hear from the prophet. It's not amazing to observe the attitude of self-importance on the part of many who are idolized by the masses. Those of us who know the Lord should remember that every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights. Every good and perfect gift comes down from God on high. You may think it's me or yourself that's doing it, but you're not. God has blessed you or me and put us in the position to do it. So Naaman is angry now. And as opposed to taking Elisha's advice and going to the Jordan, he leaves Elisha's house angry. And it says in verse number 12, he says out loud, he's telling me to go and to wash in the Jordan. He say, but are not the rivers in Syria called Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus? Are they not better than all the waters of Israel? May I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. He turned and he went away in a rage. When we are unusually blessed, we must recognize that God is the cause and that we do not deserve any credit for ourselves. But we like to give ourselves credit. We like to say what I did. Man, did you see what I did? Do you see how I worked that? How I made that happen? We like to give ourselves the credit. When I was young and foolish as an athlete, I gave myself credit. But I say I was foolish because I didn't recognize and understand that it was God that was giving me the ability to accomplish. So we generally give ourselves credit. We must keep a balanced perspective, even when he does see fit to give us fame and fortune. That balanced perspective is to know that every gift that we get, it comes from God. Every gift. There's not one gift that we receive that does not come from God. The second reason for Naaman's anger was the fact that he had been told to wash in the Jordan. He acted strongly with a typical prejudice. He deemed two rivers in Syria as superior to the Jordan. Disappointed that Elijah did not wave his hand over his leprosy, or perhaps some of the mystical gestures, he went off angry. Now we're in verse number 13, and it says, yes, sir. Yes, sir. You know, our attitude, that attitude that we have, that, you know, and that's the attitude called pride. And it says in the Bible, of the number of things that God hates, pride is first on the list.